Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Navigating Peak Season, Expert Insights on Ocean and Air Freight Shipping Trends. My name is Nerijus, Poskus, and I'm Vice President of Global Ocean Freight Procurement here at Flexport. We have a great webinar today for you, but before we begin, as always, we have to share a few housekeeping items with you. So on your screen, you will see a sidebar to the right side of the main stage. If at any time you need assistance during the live webinar, please message us in the help chat located on the sidebar. You can also ask questions via the Q&A tab on the sidebar. Time permitting, at the end of the presentation, we will be sharing questions and we'll be sharing answers to the audience questions. Make sure you add them early so they do get answered, right? Because we may not have time to answer all of them. In the main menu, above your screen, you have two tabs. In the first tab, you can download a copy of today's slide deck. On the second tab, there is a brief feedback survey for this webinar. We really appreciate your feedback. It helps us get better. Negative or positive, always appreciated. So please fill that out before exiting the webinar. All right. One more note before we begin, a brief legal note. Please keep in mind that all the info provided in this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to Flexport experts to discuss your particular situation. All right, here we go. Joining me today is my dear colleague, Thomas Kempf, Senior Director of Ocean Freight Business Development here at Flexport. Together, we're gonna tackle today's agenda. At first, I'm gonna share my ocean insights, give you some recommendations, trends, and things to watch. Then Thomas will tackle air freight, and then a short Q&A to wrap up today's sessions to ensure that everything you wanted to hear is answered. All right, so let's start with ocean freight. Ocean freight has been quite an interesting topic for the last probably 5 years onwards, right? We have not seen a normal year. So before we begin into trends, one thing that is absolutely top of mind for every single one of you is potential strike on the US East Coast. Existing contracts between the ILA and USMX expires end of September. Again, most of you probably know that, but I just want to share how it affects, if there is a strike, how it affects you. It does depend on where you're importing from. It does depend on which routing you choose, and that also will affect future state of the market for your specific trade. So just to give you some numbers, roughly 50% of US containerized imports are going through the East Coast ports, East Coast and Gulf Coast ports, right? That's a lot. On the next slide, I'm breaking it down by number of TEUs. As you can see, that translates into roughly 600,000 TEUs. 600,000 TEUs a week is traveling through these straits. Now, I really think, like I said earlier, looking at it by trade lane is key. For example, if you're importing from Caribbean or East Coast South America, almost everything is routed through the East Coast, and it's probably no surprise to those who are importing. But basically, your options would be extremely limited because that, if 95% of imports is going through East Coast or Gulf Coast ports, your ability to do anything different is extremely limited. And the downstream effects of a potential strike or actual strike, if it happens, will last significantly longer. And I will address that a little bit later as to why. West Coast South America to US is slightly less affected, but still more than 3/4 of a trade are traveling through East Coast and Gulf Coast ports. Trans-Pacific eastbound, slightly less than half, but nevertheless, it is the biggest trade lane into the US, so very, very big. On the upper right corner, you see a breakdown by what's the percentage of not US trade, but US and Gulf Coast market share by trade lane. So it happens to be also 45% for TPEB, 20-something% for transatlantic, and you can see the rest. One more takeaway that I have is different carriers will be affected slightly differently by strike. It doesn't mean we should avoid these carriers. It simply means we should watch this a little bit more. If you look at a carrier like Zim, for example, very large portions of Zim imports into the US, this specific is for trans-Pacific imports, happens to be 72% of US imports for them is going through the East Coast. So assuming there is a strike, all the ships are traveling to the East Coast. Think about what happens at origin. 72% of that carriers for that specific trade equipment is also stuck. That will not come back to Asia on time. Well, if strike happens for, let's say, a day or two, maybe it's not that big of a deal. It is estimated that every day of a strike is going to cause a backlog of anywhere between 5 to 10 days. That estimation is what I heard from shipping lines. Different shipping lines say different numbers, but they are pretty close, 5 to 10, right? So if it's a few days, 10 days of backlog is obviously impactful, because it would be, say, 70 days of, it would take 70 days to come back to normal. Now, imagine again, if it did happen and equipment is unavailable, carriers' ability to offer extra loaders and different solutions and via different trade lanes, for example, via the West Coast, will be a little bit more affected. Again, it doesn't mean they can't offer, it just means it's something to watch, because more equipment will be stuck for these particular carriers. On the next slide, I want to share major drivers to watch. So now, forget the strike. Let's just look at the major drivers. What is most important for 2025 and what you need to watch? Top of mind outside of ILA and zooming out globally, alliance changes and corporations, so Gemini is not an alliance, it's a corporation, are happening all over the map. Nearly every single carrier has announced different services except Ocean Alliance for 2025. MSC will be acting independently. Nevertheless, ONE will be partnering, or actually MSC will be partnering with Premier Alliance on the Asia-Europe, potentially in other trades as well, like ISC to United States. The alliance is becoming Ocean Alliance, is becoming Premier Alliance, with Hapag-Lloyd leaving them and joining the Gemini Alliance Corporation. Gemini Corporation is going to do things very differently. They will run, instead of a loop, they will run shuttle services, which will significantly impact transit times, sometimes better, sometimes worse. And if it works as advertised, it should improve the reliability for that alliance. Now, will that happen or not? Again, we have to watch. It does look promising, but like I said, we have to watch. Red Sea remains closed, and shipping lines basically stopped guessing what will happen in 2025. So what they did, nearly all of them announced two types of service networks for 2025. One via Cape and one via Suez. So, give you an example, Gemini Corporation would require 300 vessels to operate via Suez, and 340 vessels to offer the same services, obviously longer transit times, via Cape. Again, major driver to watch. If it does open, things can very quickly change. It will affect pricing, which we're going to get into a second. Next thing to watch, and the driver for trade, is capacity and demand. I'm not going to try to predict demand. I think the economists are better at that, but I can look at the capacity. 2 million TEUs are scheduled to be delivered in 2025. Largest injections will be by MSC, the largest independent and largest carrier altogether globally, and CMA. Big question is, how will these carriers and others that receive new ships manage it? Again, we have to watch. Where will that capacity be deployed? Will these carriers be better off in a tight equipment position if there is a strike? All these things cannot be answered just yet, but we have to watch them. Port congestion is a huge driver these days for reducing global effective capacity. If you look at even today's global congestion, almost 10% of current global capacity is being absorbed, some of it very temporarily, but still absorbed by congestion. 3 million TEUs. Well, that's a lot. That is not even including any effects of an ILA strike. If that was to happen, that number would go way, way, way above the 9%. The current number is mainly affected by the typhoon in Shanghai and Ningbo, right? The vessels simply couldn't enter the ports. It caused temporary delays. The last driver, in my opinion, to watch is continuous e-commerce growth. If you remember 5-7 years ago, only 2 premium services existed from Trans-Pacific to United States, West Coast, Matson and APL back then. With the rise of e-commerce and very low reliability on regular services, there is rising demand for more reliability and more premium services. Gemini Corporation is promising to fix it by running shuttle services. That's not yet proven, but again, it is something new. And at the same time, I do expect that more premium services and solutions are going to be launched on a particular probably most likely on Trans-Pacific to US West Coast because of short distance and an ability to actually ensure that premium services work. And in my opinion, Southeast Asia is most likely going to be where demand for premium will be the largest. Next slide. Let's zoom into price drivers, right? A lot of you need to know what is going to happen to price. And with so many things up in the air, Red Sea, typhoons, weather, congestion, looming strike, equipment unavailability, like how can one predict what happens to a price? Well, the short answer is at this time, no one can predict, but I can tell you what are the drivers and what do we need to watch. And then you need to join monthly Flexport webinars where we actually zoom into these things and see, what's actually happening at that time. Predicting for something 6 months out is nearly impossible because there's so many black swan events that happened, plus simple disruptions that happen in today's market can affect the whole trade very, very quickly. And the reason that simple disruptions are more impactful today than they were pre-COVID, for example, is the industry doesn't have as much slack in terms of equipment, in terms of ships. So anything happens, it affects everything globally. It's like a domino effect. All right, so biggest driver for the price. If the strike happens on the East Coast to United States, how long it lasts, that's going to affect everything. Like it will affect global congestion, it will affect equipment availability at origin, it will affect everything. So that's the number one thing to watch. Besides that, like I mentioned, capacity, how much capacity is coming in is not everything. Well, how much capacity is going to be blanked by shipping lines? Blanked meaning that the services may not be sailing as planned. With the recent alliance changes and less members in each alliance except Ocean Alliance, it's slightly easier to plan these things, especially for large independent carriers, for example, like MSC. They don't need anyone's permission to have a blank sailing. If there is too much, if there's not enough demand, well, you should watch and see it's going to happen. The next one is, as I mentioned, routings. If the Red Sea opens, price, it's a big driver. Prices should be going down. If equipment is unavailable in Asia or Europe, for that matter, or anywhere else, well, what happens then is you can have all the capacity in the world if the cargo can be loaded, and we have seen this has been a big issue in the last few years. Prices are going up. Congestion is going up. Weather delays, again, prices may be going up. Bunker and ETS and new laws in Europe, very important as well. Something happened to the slides. Now we are back. Okay, so watch these things. They will affect the pricing very significantly. And when we get closer, we will tell you more what this will do to your contracts. Next slide, please. I want to give you some recommendations. And all right, so with all these changes happening, my key recommendations would be, number one, diversify your carrier options with blank sailings, equipment issues that are not necessarily affecting the whole industry. Like, we have to remember this equipment, for the most part, with very few % of the trade, or equipment is owned by shipping lines. So it may affect one shipping line, but another shipping line may have equipment, which is exactly what we have seen in this year and also last year. One carrier has zero equipment in Thailand, another one has a surplus. Same thing with blank sailings. Same thing with new alliance or new cooperation, I shall say, from Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk, like the Gemini, right? It's a completely new, unproven concept. It looks promising, but don't put all your eggs in one basket. Diversify. The second one is more of a trend. Capacity increases. Again, 2 million TEUs is huge. It doesn't mean that market will soften. It can, but again, watch the carriers will continue managing capacity tightly. I added a graph on the right side. Take a look at Trans-Pacific imports to the United States and what's the remaining capacity by week for the last week of September, October, and weeks 41, 42, 43. You see a golden week. Golden week is week 41. Carriers are removing close to, again, depending on the routing, East Coast, West Coast, or PNW, almost 30%, 35% of capacity, again, depending on the routing, is removed because carriers do expect that there's going to be less demand due to Golden Week and due some uncertainty with, again, potentially a looming strike. Importers are probably booking slightly less now because they want to wait and see what happens. Again, carriers are acting. The third one, strong carrier relationships are crucial. Loyalty still pays off. And some of you may be like, well, some carriers did not deliver on their promises on long-term contracts. They broke them down. Well, that may be true to some, but not to all. There definitely are still carriers, and many of them are at least our core carriers that do deliver on long-term contracts. And you will get the preferential treatment during disruptions if something happens. If you work with Flexport, I'm not jumping from one carrier to another carrier for every time you get a $50 discount. Number 4, carriers have plans for Suez and Cape routings. Well, you should do the same. Your lead times will be cut at least 15% if you're importing on, again, depending on the routes, say globally, if the Red Sea opens. So again, plan for it. Everything can change very quickly if the Red Sea is open. Fifth one I kind of mentioned a little bit is hub and spoke. But one more important thing is the hub and spoke new model by Gemini Corporation will have significant transit time advantages. I'm not even talking reliability yet. Some port pairs, they're going to be much faster than today's alliances. On others, they're going to be significantly slower because they will have 1 or 2 transshipments to get from a port pair that today may be direct. Slower doesn't mean unreliable. The whole goal of launching the hub and spoke is to increase the reliability. They tend to control most of the terminals on these shuttles. Again, anyways, something to watch. There is no one size fits all. Shanghai to Los Angeles, you probably are pretty good with Gemini. Ningbo to Los Angeles or Oakland, well, that's, to me at least, is a red flag today. Last 2 before I hand it over to Thomas. With all this volatility, blank sailings, new services, equipment issues, I believe that index contracts are one of the very good tools to ensure you're paying the right price. You don't want to be under the market. If you pay less than everybody else, your cargo will be somewhat deprioritized. If you pay above the market, well, you're not doing very well. Your company is overpaying. Your goods may not be as competitive in the market. So obviously you want to pay the right price. And indexed, it's not a holy grail for everyone, but it is a new concept and it is slowly taking off. Here at Flexport on Asia-Europe trade, we offer it to everyone. On Trans-Pacific, it's also going up. And even with some shipping lines, we now have index contracts that go up and down based on different carriers have different indices, but mostly it's on SCFI, Shanghai Containerized Freight Index, and it gets updated every week or month or quarter, depending on the agreement. If the index goes up by 100, your price goes up by 100. Index goes down by 100, your price goes down by 100. Last one, focus on data quality. Not just us, but also shipping lines are getting a lot better at identifying who is overbooking, wrong cargo ready dates. When you say my cargo is ready, but we actually try to book it, it's not ready, then your SO is being canceled. High cancellations, all of this is affecting your loading priority. Again, it's not yet with every single shipping line, but it's more and more important. And if you don't get this right, your cargo will be less and less prioritized in the event of disruption going forward. Well, those will be my ocean freight recommendations. It's time to hand it over to Thomas for air freight.
Hi everyone, let's get started with air freight. First and foremost, let's look at the big picture, where we're heading as we enter the Q4, so also known as peak season. On one side, overall message, the air market is taking off and is preparing itself for a peak season. A couple different indicators to point out here as to the indicators why this is happening. On one side, we can see the rates. We can see the rates increasing not just year on year, but also on a two-week trend by 2 percentage points. When we look at the regional numbers behind that, of course, largely attributable to the Asia Pacific region, but also ongoing Middle East and South Asia influence on those rate developments. These are the two major regions that drive this development of the rates, and they continue to do so and expected to do so in the remainder of Q4. When we look at the capacity situation there, we can see that year on year, we still have an overall one single digit growth factor in capacity, but it has been hovering around the stable number of around 0 to -1 and +1% now in the past weeks. So that means also we are back to more or less capacity levels of pre-COVID levels. For the chargeable weight, also known as the demand, we can see that that's in line with that overall storyline, the market taking off, right? We got stable capacity, but we have demand picking up very strongly. We're looking at year-on-year growth of 10%, and then this, except two regions that are in the red, but mainly looking at a two-week trend of +3%, which is just what we expect as we start Q4 season. When we look at those rate levels, and they are very, very high globally speaking, right? We are currently at 50% rate levels that above pre-COVID. Still seen as an indicator, probably as we move into next year, and we'll have the first semi-normal air freight year, which was 2024 to some extent behind us. We'll probably look more and more towards the future, not that much anymore into 2019 numbers, but it's still a good reference point as we are exiting the year 2024. Last but not least, we have seen regions like South Asia, particularly countries Bangladesh on the Indian subcontinent, but also Dubai to US tonnages. They're really, really tremendously growing, not just on a rate side, but also on the tonnage side. Particularly the Dubai to US example here, 4 weeks on 4 weeks. You can see a plus 50% over the past 4 weeks in terms of tonnages. Of course, some of those factors we already know, and they include the Red Sea crisis, as well as making sure that the high demand from particularly Southeast Asia to Europe can be covered. And there, the port of Dubai is definitely takes center stage nowadays. Next slide. Now let's look at the capacity developments. On the right side, you see the most recent IATA numbers for the first 7 months of this year, and then a couple summary points on the left side. One big thing here to call out is, of course, when we look at the total market, right on the chart, we can see that the actual demand so the chargeable tonnage kilometers at 13.6% is far higher than the available tonnage, chargeable tonnage kilometers. And particularly two regions stand out here: Asia Pacific with 70.6% actual increase year on year, versus the available capacity of 11.3% increase. And still the gap is not as big, but since it's an important lane or origin, I shall say, North America, where we also have that imbalance. Couple different factors. Well, first of all, we still see the Russia-Ukraine closed airspace, right? That causes European carriers right now to reevaluate their China to Europe flights. In recent weeks, we have seen the announcements, particularly it kicked off with Virgin Cargo, and then Lufthansa also announced that they are, in the case of Virgin, stopping after 25 years of service the Shanghai to London Heathrow route. In the case of Lufthansa, they are scaling back capacity between Beijing and Frankfurt, and are evaluating potential further measures on that route. Of course, at the same time, we have so while this has an impact on the European carrier side, it doesn't have as much an impact on the Middle Eastern carrier side. So it shall be seen how that plays out at the end, what that really means for capacity deployment. We do know that many of the airlines are currently either looking at, or they have already done so, shifting further capacity from North America to Asia. Concrete examples in recent weeks have been KLM, have been Lufthansa redeploying, and also for the first time operating, in the case of Lufthansa, a 777 freighter from Ho Chi Minh to the West Coast, and then basically going around the globe doing one full turn. It's the first time. It shows really that something is happening in the market, and airlines are responding rather quickly to capture the opportunities, but still unseen in the case of Lufthansa, that at least in the recent years, that we see that kind of freighter deployments out of Asia to the US, which is good news for shippers and for airlines to be seen. And Qatar, another example where we also see them pulling some capacity out of South America and redeploying that to Asia Pacific. The last one to call out, maybe not as much as we go into Q4, but definitely as we enter 2025, is what happens with when oil prices are increasing and potentially in 2025 could reach higher critical levels again. Well, the same storyline applies, right? We've seen in the past, we will see potentially earlier than planned freighter retirements, especially the 4-engine planes, and that nevertheless will have an impact, knowing as well that the majority of those planes are operating on the Trans-Pacific, both eastbound and westbound. So that will be a critical factor when we look at capacity developments in 2025. Next slide. So everybody always looks, of course, at the end result when you put the demand and the capacity together, and that's the rates. So when we zoom out for a moment before we look into Q4 and we say, okay, where have we come on the 12 months from July in 23 to August 24? The latest numbers basically show strong increases, particularly out of Vietnam. This everybody knows already, but it is quite a big number, right? 114% increase on the rates. When we look at Hong Kong and Shanghai, the number is slightly lower than that at 21 to 36 percentage points. And the one call out here is on the transatlantic, where we have actually seen a negative rate development and also very stable rate development. Now, for the current state, we do expect those elevated rates to persist, particularly, of course, driven by the geopolitical uncertainties, but also the disruptions that my colleague already mentioned at the US ports. It's evident that this will have an effect. And I will mention it in my summary slide in the recommendations afterwards. We have also seen the rate increases, particularly coming from the outbound Asia markets. And what this basically means for carriers is that they struggle, obviously, with the profitability on the backhaul, right? So particularly when you look, for example, from the US to Asia, where they get a weak return on those flights investments. Transatlantic rates I've already mentioned, and there we are really looking at not just in Q4 but also in going into Q1, which is still the winter schedule, so less transatlantic capacity than the summer months, but we're still looking at abundant capacity there and less impact from global issues for evident factors. The e-commerce, everybody has heard by now the number, but if you give a Q4 update, you have to mention it again, right? It's estimated roughly by Boeing that we're talking here about 100 777s daily from China to the US alone. When you throw in there, in addition to this e-commerce demand, the ocean shipping disruptions, right, that continue. I think by now we're marking the 1 year mark of the Red Sea conflicts. That's certainly a mix that will continue its pressure on the rates. And on the transatlantic, of course, we will not expect the same trends there. Just a little potential summer dip, but for now, as we go into Q4, we will see on the transatlantic less capacity, rates to stable / slight go up, but potentially really remain on a very low digit percentage increase, if at all. The de minimis regulations, of course, with a huge impact on e-commerce. Everybody is wondering about what it really means at the end. And at the end of the day, also then we're looking at the US elections, of course. But what could both these things mean in general? Well, on the short-term side, the elections and the regulations, once the clear dates are in place, could lead to a short-term surge in imports from China and ahead of these anticipated tariffs, as well as the US election results. So this is more a psychological thing, especially on the US election side, but it still has to be called out that those two are the main drivers of what could happen to the transatlantic market when it comes to rates and capacity. And last but not least, a drop in consumer demand definitely might ease those rates as we look at the economy global indicators for 2025. But at this point in time, still unclear of what this could mean for Q4. I think right now we're really looking at a peak that has started definitely earlier than last year, around 4 weeks ahead of time, roughly, according to what we see in the numbers. So that means already it's a strong indicator of what is to come in this Q4. Next slide. So Q4 2024 expectations on rates. Of course, there you can't summarize it across the globe. You have to dive into the different trade lanes. So China to the US, current demand versus supply is definitely not looking favorable, right? You got much more demand than supply, and you throw on top of this the e-commerce trend. So we can expect those rates, at least on those high levels, to remain, but we've already seen slight increases on what is already a very tight market. So expecting slight increases, definitely to medium increases on the China to US at this point, because we're already on rather high levels. When we look at MESA to EU, there some degree of stabilization is expected, especially also out of Bangladesh, but no big rate drops we foresee currently as long as the Red Sea crisis persists. On the transatlantic, now we have by now discussed it in depth and from all angles, but they're remaining expecting a stable rate environment to remain. And of course, PAX capacity there will remain because the bellies, so the passenger planes fly where the passengers need to go and not where obviously the cargo needs to go. But what is a bit more uncertain is how much of the freighter capacity might shift in that weaker transatlantic environment to Asia Pacific with those carriers that I called out before, leading by examples. So that's definitely a trend to follow closely as well as we embark on the journey into Q4 and through Q4. And then Vietnam, of course, a very important market, especially in recent years with heavyweight supply chain players moving some of the capacity from China to Vietnam. So everybody now, of course, looks at Vietnam as well. We remain definitely cautious there on the market in terms of expecting those elevated levels and high rates to continue, especially as we enter Q4 and the new product introduction, so NPI launch season that has started already with the new iPhone and other gadgets being available to consumers this month. Next slide, please. So wrapping it up here, the major drivers in Q4 to watch that have a potential on the air freight pricing side of things: fuel prices as a summary, right? Economic conditions we have mentioned, the capacity and demand imbalance, right? So we are definitely seeing that global demand is still outpacing supply, except for one region. So that's going to be one to watch. The supply chain disruptions that we have heard from my colleague again on the ocean side, and that we're also looking very carefully on what this means. And we've had another webinar on this, and the e-commerce growth. There again, just keeping in mind that we have two things there. We have one, the e-commerce demand that still remains right now, and keeping in mind that those business models of those e-commerce players were designed not to make money based on low tariffs, but to cater to U.S. consumers, and particularly for low value goods or lower priced goods, we shall say. So this is something we're going to watch for, and we're obviously going to know more in a couple of weeks with concrete outcomes of the de minimis section 321. Next slide. So looking ahead, e-commerce, of course, expects a strong peak season. We expect 20 to 30% more volume there, and up to 60% in the weeks leading up to Black Friday. When we look at the capacity side, well, most Asian carriers seem to have already sold their ad hoc charter capacity until the end of the year, which makes sense by now, of course, but also sold 85% on scheduled capacity. There's only a few carriers that still offer peak season extra capacity. So by now, the train really has left the station. And we look at the US, EU, and Middle East carriers, as well as the charter operators. What we see there is that they all have tried, at least to a certain extent, to keep 1/5 roughly of their spare capacity to offer to spot market during peak. So carriers operating out of these regions, we can still expect that those 20% will more or less, depending on the carrier, of course, be available as we enter Q4. Next and final slide, I shall say. So the recommendations from the air freight side, well, it's all about forecasting and planning as specific as you can be, mitigating the risks of insufficient capacity that we have seen here, working very close with your suppliers as well as the partners to steer on a weekly basis your freight flow. Fixed collection days and timely updates can also help, of course, all stakeholders involved. Needless to say, the second one, book as early as possible prior to cargo-ready dates. Ideally, we recommend to place your bookings with your LSP 5 to 7 days prior to the cargo date, to just make sure that there's enough time for all parties to plan. The sea air service remains a good alternative. We're seeing indicative transit times of anything between 21 to 24 days. Can be a bit more than that, but this is like an indicative number, especially on the Far East westbound via Dubai, or also on the Trans-Pacific eastbound via Incheon. Definitely something to look into if you have goods that have the option and you have products that are worthwhile to be transported by air. And the last one, reduced batch size of shipments. So maximum 15, 20 CBM per shipment. Definitely still the North Light, just to facilitate the capacity access, especially when we're talking about potential strikes and potential FCL to air conversions. This will be essential to require to make sure that those splits are done correctly. So just watch out for that, especially in the next weeks as we will see what happens to the port strikes. That's it from the air freight side. And now I think we have a couple minutes to also look into some questions. So let me dive right in. So we have one here, one question from Piotr Sadon. What are the projections for the length of potential U.S. coast and Mexican Gulf port strikes? Nerijus, I think that one would be.
Yeah, I would say it's very difficult to predict how long it will happen. It's much more like what are the effects of the strike. So I say let's not predict the length of it. No one knows, right? Like I said, the longer it lasts, the bigger the impact, and the impact isn't linear. At the beginning, if the strike does happen, um, it's essentially, how would you call that? It's initial buildup of congestion. And you could say it's an escalation of a buildup. And then it's a peak congestion when the vessels can no longer come and they start bunching up, right? If that happens, that's the peak congestion. The ships are no longer coming anymore because let's just say you have 10 or 20 vessels waiting on the East Coast. They can't get in. On the other side of the ocean in Asia or Europe for that matter, LATAM, you probably would see that the carriers would be like, okay, we don't need to send more ships to the already very congested area until the strike is resolved. So that's, I think, what we need to watch. And I just, I don't think we can answer how long we expect the strike to happen. No one knows, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. We have another question here from Nikolai Klopstein. Well, yes, you can definitely get in touch. I will just share my email right now with you. It's tkempf@flexport.com, and I'll support you directly. So please feel free to reach out. Thanks for the question. Nerijus, we have a couple other questions here, I think, coming up. Do you want to dive in to the ones?
I see that as well. Olivier is asking about have we seen people shifting already from the East Coast to the West Coast expecting a strike? Yes, we do see that happening. It's not happening on a large scale. If I had to say, probably 5% of trans-Pacific imports have shifted from East Coast to West Coast. We do see more people just pausing. There is still an opportunity to do so. The vessels are still accepting cargo to the West Coast pre-Golden Week. I think we should take those bookings in latest. I guess by Monday, as long as your factories are able to load, you can probably even do it a few days later next week. The limitation, like I said, is the Golden Week. Most factories in at least China are closed. Southeast Asia maybe is a little bit less affected. If you're importing from transatlantic, that shift, or LATAM, Africa for that matter, that shift is nearly impossible. Remember, we had a slide showing what's the percentage of the trade going to the West Coast. So, yep, here's that. I encourage everyone who has very urgent POs and want to meet Black Friday sales and have a very, very important date and can't afford the risk. And we're not saying strike will happen. That no one even knows that. The strike may get resolved before October 1. But if it doesn't, and you need an insurance policy and you're importing from Asia, the options are still out there. If you're importing from transatlantic, well, you should probably talk to Thomas.
With pleasure. And one last question here that we have from the audience, and please feel free to keep the questions coming. We still have 2 minutes left. There is another ocean-related question: routing via Mexico ports, is that an option?
It is an option via Lázaro Cárdenas, Mexico. You can access Dallas, Kansas City. It's a very small portion of the U.S. imports. It can take a lot of additional cargo. There are customs complexities. I'm not the biggest expert of what the consequences are if you're importing via Mexico. I just know that that trade does exist. And there are a few shipping lines that launched or added additional capacity on that trade. So yes, it can take probably a few hundred T's a week for the whole country. Again, opportunity out there. Who will jump first? I would say I would take the PSW routing via Los Angeles, Long Beach first. Those are less complicated, and pricing is still low comparing to where it was a few months back. And we're yet to see a spike of price increases, which again tells me that the shift hasn't been dramatic. Everyone is wait and see mode.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thanks for sharing that perspective. So looking at the time here, and no more questions it seems right now. If there's any other ones, as usual, feel free to throw them in there, and we'll still get back to you on those questions. And we will also email the link to the recording tomorrow morning. Otherwise, this concludes today's webinar, and we thank you all for attending. Thank you, and have a great day.